This is one of those questions that sounds almost too obvious to ask until you actually start digging into the specifics, and then it turns into one of the most genuinely fascinating rabbit holes in all of animal behavior. Let's get into it. Picture this: a massive, dominant wolf, the kind of animal that could absolutely demolish any other wolf in the pack without much effort, gets bowled over by a clumsy, uncoordinated wolf pup who's basically just learned how to walk properly. The pup nips at the adult's face, tugs on its ear, climbs over its back like it's a piece of furniture rather than an apex predator. And the adult just lets it happen. No growling, no correction, no reminder of the pack hierarchy that this same adult would absolutely enforce against any other adult wolf showing this kind of disrespect. Somehow, in that one tiny window of puppyhood, all the normal rules just stop applying. This isn't some fluke either. This exact pattern, animals treating their young with a completely different rulebook than the one they apply to adults, shows up across species that are about as different from each other as you can possibly get. And once you start noticing it, you can't really stop noticing it. So let's actually dig into the real question here. Do animals genuinely treat babies differently? And if so, why does this happen with such consistency across the animal kingdom, even in species that otherwise show almost no flexibility or tolerance in their day-to-day social behavior? Let's start with something researchers call the puppy license, because it's a genuinely useful concept and it explains a huge chunk of what we're talking about today. In wolf packs, and in domestic dog social groups too, young pups are essentially granted temporary social immunity. They can break rules that would get an adult wolf seriously disciplined, sometimes violently, and instead get a pass almost every single time. A pup can bite an alpha's ear, steal food directly out from under an adult's nose, interrupt a serious social interaction entirely uninvited, and the worst punishment they're likely to get is a firm nudge or a brief exaggerated grumble that's honestly more theater than actual discipline. This license typically expires around 4 to 5 months of age, at which point the young wolf suddenly discovers that the rules it's been ignoring its entire life actually do apply to it now, usually through a much less gentle correction than anything it experienced before. Why would an entire species build in this kind of temporary exemption? The leading explanation comes down to brain development and learning. Young animals are still figuring out social cues, physical coordination, and communication signals. If every clumsy mistake got punished with full adult-level severity, you'd end up with a population of permanently anxious, under-socialized adults who never properly learned how their own species' social systems work. By relaxing the rules during this critical developmental window, the species essentially creates a safe practice zone where young animals can mess up repeatedly without facing consequences severe enough to damage their long-term development. It's basically built-in tolerance for incompetence, specifically engineered to let learning happen. Now, here's where this gets even more interesting, because this leniency isn't limited to social rule-breaking. It extends into actual physical aggression too, and this shows up in a genuinely wild way across primates. Adult male chimpanzees, animals that can be brutally violent toward rival males and even toward females in certain contexts, show a dramatically different behavioral profile around infants, including infants that aren't biologically their own. There are documented cases of adult males tolerating infants climbing on them, pulling their fur, even slapping at their faces during play, behavior that would trigger an immediate, serious response if an adult chimp tried the exact same thing. Researchers studying this have pointed to something called infant handling tolerance, a behavioral category that shows up specifically and consistently around juveniles, almost like there's a separate set of behavioral software running specifically for anything recognized as a baby. This raises a question worth sitting with. How does an animal even know something is a baby in the first place? It's not like baby animals are walking around with little name tags. The answer here is genuinely one of the coolest concepts in all of animal psychology, something called the baby schema, sometimes also referred to by its original scientific term, Kindchen schema. This concept describes a specific cluster of physical features: large head relative to body size, big eyes, round face, short limbs, that triggers automatic caretaking responses across an enormous range of species, including humans. This isn't some cute coincidence. It's a deeply wired visual trigger that essentially short-circuits aggressive or dismissive responses and replaces them with gentleness, protectiveness, and increased attention. The wild part is that this trigger doesn't always stay neatly contained within a single species. Big eyes and a round face on a completely unrelated animal can still partially activate this same response, which is part of why videos of baby animals of basically any species reliably break the internet. Our own baby detection system doesn't always check ID before firing. Let's talk about lions for a second, because lions' social structure provides one of the most dramatic examples of differentiated treatment toward young, and it's honestly a little unsettling once you understand the mechanics behind it. When a new male takes over a pride, displacing the previous dominant male, it's well documented that the incoming male will often kill cubs from the previous male's bloodline. This sounds like it completely contradicts everything we're talking about today, animals being gentle and protective toward young, and in a sense it does, but it actually reinforces the underlying point in a different way. The treatment young lions receive isn't based on some universal species-wide gentleness rule, it's based entirely on relatedness and investment. Cubs that share the new male's genetics get intense, dedicated protection, tolerance for behavior that would never be accepted from an adult lion, and significant parental investment. Cubs that don't share his genetics get the exact opposite treatment. This tells us something important. A huge amount of differentiated treatment toward babies isn't some blanket softness toward anything small and helpless. It's a highly specific calculation tied to genetic investment, and the gentleness we associate with baby treatment is actually layered on top of and sometimes completely overridden by that calculation. This is honestly one of the most important nuances in this entire topic. Animal gentleness toward young isn't some universal moral instinct floating around independently of evolutionary logic. It's deeply tied to investment, relatedness, and survival calculus. Where that calculus favors protection, we see extraordinary, almost theatrical gentleness. Where it doesn't, we sometimes see behavior that looks shockingly brutal by human standards, and both extremes come from the exact same underlying evolutionary logic, just pointed in different directions depending on the specific situation an animal finds itself in. Now let's pivot to something a little less dramatic and a lot more universally heartwarming. Alloparenting, a concept we've touched on before, but one that deserves a much deeper look, specifically in the context of differentiated treatment. Alloparenting describes situations where animals other than the biological parents take on caretaking responsibilities toward young, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for extended periods. Elephants are a fantastic example here. Within an elephant herd, young calves are looked after not just by their mother but by an entire network of related females. Aunts, older sisters, grandmothers, sometimes even unrelated females who've integrated into the herd's social structure. These auntie-elephants show measurably different behavior toward calves compared to how they interact with adult herd members. They tolerate clumsy bumping, allow calves to use their bodies for shade and protection, and actively position themselves to shield calves from threats during travel. This entire support network only activates around vulnerable young. Adult elephants don't extend this same protective behavior toward other adults nearly as readily, which tells us this isn't some generalized elephant kindness, it's a very specific behavioral mode that gets switched on by the presence of vulnerable offspring. Meerkats provide one of the more entertaining examples of this concept in action. Meerkat colonies operate with a strict, surprisingly rigid social hierarchy, dominant breeding pairs, subordinate helpers, clear pecking order enforced through aggressive posturing and occasional actual aggression. And yet, the moment pups are involved, that entire hierarchy seems to take a back seat. Subordinate meerkats that might otherwise face aggression from dominant members instead get treated with notable patience, specifically while performing babysitting duties, standing guard over pups while the rest of the group forages, sometimes going without food themselves to maintain that watch. The colony's survival depends heavily on pups making it to adulthood, and that priority appears to reshape social dynamics specifically around anything categorized as vulnerable juvenile, even temporarily suspending normal hierarchy enforcement to make sure the babysitting gets done properly. Let's talk about something genuinely strange and slightly hilarious: play behavior differences. Adult animals across a huge range of species show dramatically different play styles depending on whether they're interacting with another adult or with a juvenile. Adult dogs playing with other adult dogs tend to engage in fairly even reciprocal play, matched intensity, mutual chasing, roughly equal give and take. The same adult dog playing with a puppy will often deliberately handicap itself, exaggerating its movements, slowing down its chase speed, allowing the puppy to win small contests it would never win against a similarly sized adult. Researchers refer to this as self-handicapping, and it shows up across an impressively wide range of species, including primates, big cats in captivity, and even some birds. This isn't accidental gentleness, it's a deliberate, calculated adjustment specifically designed to keep play within a range the younger animal can actually handle, which suggests a level of behavioral flexibility and, frankly, social awareness that's honestly pretty impressive for animals we don't always give enough credit to. There's also something worth mentioning about vocal communication specifically directed at young versus adults. Many species use distinctly different vocalizations when communicating with juveniles compared to other adults: softer tones, simplified call structures, repeated patterns. This might sound oddly familiar, mostly because it's strikingly similar to how human parents instinctively shift into a higher-pitched, slower, more exaggerated speech pattern when talking to infants, something researchers call parentese. Studies on certain primate species and even some bird species have identified comparable vocal adjustments specifically directed at young individuals, suggesting this instinct to simplify and soften communication toward vulnerable juveniles might be a far more widespread evolutionary pattern than just a uniquely human quirk. Now let's bring predators into this conversation, because predator behavior toward prey young provides one of the most counterintuitive examples in this entire topic. There are documented cases, admittedly inconsistent and species-dependent, of certain predators showing reduced predatory drive specifically toward very young prey animals compared to adults, sometimes choosing to ignore an extremely young, defenseless animal entirely in favor of pursuing an adult that requires significantly more effort to catch. This sounds completely backwards from a pure energy efficiency standpoint. A baby animal should logically be the easiest possible meal. Some researchers suggest this might relate to underdeveloped scent or movement cues in very young prey failing to fully trigger a predator's hunting response, essentially flying under the radar of instincts calibrated mainly toward adult prey behavior patterns. Others suggest it might simply be inconsistent individual variation rather than any kind of deliberate sparing behavior. Either way, it's a genuinely strange wrinkle in a topic that otherwise leans heavily toward animals are deliberately gentler with babies. A reminder that not every piece of this puzzle fits into one tidy explanation. Let's circle back to something a little more emotionally satisfying: cross-species baby tolerance. There are numerous documented cases of animals adopting, nursing, or protecting young from entirely different species, behavior that seems to circle right back to that baby schema concept we talked about earlier. Documented cases include dogs nursing orphaned kittens, cats caring for orphaned squirrels, and even more dramatic examples like a lioness in a wildlife reserve that was observed adopting and protecting an oryx calf for several days, despite oryx normally being well within a lion's typical prey range. These cross-species adoption cases are rare, and they don't always end well biologically speaking, but their existence at all tells us something important about how deeply wired the vulnerable young trigger gentleness instinct really is. It's powerful enough to occasionally override an animal's own predatory instincts entirely, even if just temporarily, simply because the visual and behavioral cues of helplessness are strong enough to flip a switch that evolution clearly built to prioritize protection over almost everything else. There's also a genuinely interesting angle involving hormonal changes that drive a lot of this differentiated treatment, and it's worth bringing in the actual biology here rather than just describing the behavior. Prolactin and oxytocin levels rise significantly in many mammal species, specifically around the presence of vulnerable young, even in individuals that aren't the biological parent. This hormonal shift has been documented not just in mothers but in fathers, siblings, and even unrelated group members in certain cooperatively breeding species. These hormonal changes correlate directly with increased patience, increased caretaking behavior, and reduced aggression specifically toward the young triggering the response. This means a huge amount of differentiated treatment toward babies isn't purely a conscious behavioral choice an animal is making moment to moment. It's partly a measurable internal chemical shift that happens automatically in response to specific triggers, the same general mechanism, just tuned slightly differently across an enormous range of unrelated species. Birds offer a particularly interesting variation on this whole topic, mostly because bird parenting involves a level of intensity that mammal parenting often doesn't quite match. Many bird species show extreme self-sacrificing behavior specifically triggered by the presence of chicks, parents that will repeatedly risk their own safety performing distraction displays to lure predators away from a nest, sometimes feigning injury themselves to draw attention away from vulnerable young. This kind of behavior essentially never shows up in the context of protecting another adult bird. It's almost exclusively reserved for offspring specifically. The intensity of this differentiated treatment suggests that in many bird species, the presence of dependent young doesn't just adjust behavior slightly, it fundamentally reorganizes an individual's entire risk tolerance and priority structure for as long as those young remain dependent. Let's also talk about something a little less obvious: physical gentleness calibration, the ability of an animal to adjust the literal physical force of its own actions depending on who it's interacting with. This shows up dramatically in larger, more physically powerful animals. Adult gorillas, animals capable of exerting forces that could seriously injure or kill a human or another gorilla without much effort, have been repeatedly documented handling infants, both their own and occasionally human infants in captive settings, with what can only be described as remarkable, almost surgical precision and restraint. This level of fine motor control, specifically calibrated around fragility, isn't something that develops randomly. It suggests these animals possess a level of body awareness and intentional restraint that's genuinely impressive, especially considering how effortlessly destructive these same animals can be in other contexts entirely. There's also something worth discussing about how this differentiated treatment changes as young animals age, because it's rarely an all-or-nothing switch. It's usually a gradual scaling process. Young animals don't go from completely protected and indulged to fully held to adult standards overnight. Instead, most species show a slow tapering process, where tolerance for mistakes, physical roughness, and rule-breaking gradually decreases as the young animal demonstrates increasing competence, coordination, and social understanding. This tapering process appears to be at least partially responsive to the individual animal's actual development, rather than a fixed, rigid timeline, meaning slower developing individuals within a species sometimes receive an extended grace period compared to their faster developing peers. This level of individualized calibration, adjusting tolerance based on actual observed competence rather than just age alone, suggests a surprisingly sophisticated level of social tracking happening within these groups. Animals essentially running a constant, informal assessment of where each young individual currently stands developmentally. There's also a fascinating angle here involving sibling dynamics that almost never gets discussed, and it adds a whole extra layer of nuance to this topic. In species where multiple young are raised together, the differentiated treatment toward babies doesn't apply equally across every juvenile in the group. Older siblings in many species, wolves, primates, even certain birds, are gradually expected to take on more responsibility and tolerate less indulgence as younger siblings arrive. A phenomenon that looks almost suspiciously similar to the classic human experience of an older child suddenly being told to act their age the moment a new baby shows up. Researchers studying primate troops have noted that juvenile chimpanzees who once received extensive tolerance and gentle handling from adults often see that tolerance shift dramatically once a younger sibling is born, with caretaking attention and behavioral leniency redirected almost entirely toward the newest, most vulnerable member of the family unit. This isn't favoritism in some emotional sense, it's simply the same investment-based calculation we talked about earlier, recalibrating in real time based on which individual currently represents the greatest vulnerability and the greatest evolutionary stakes. It's also worth talking about how this differentiated treatment interacts with group size and resource availability, because the gentleness toward young that we've spent most of this discussion highlighting isn't some fixed, unconditional constant. In times of severe resource scarcity, some species show a measurable reduction in the intensity of caretaking behavior. sometimes even abandoning the youngest or weakest offspring in a litter entirely in favor of concentrating limited resources on the offspring most likely to survive regardless. This sounds harsh, and it is, but it reinforces something we've touched on throughout this entire discussion. Differentiated treatment toward babies isn't some sentimental, unconditional rule written into nature out of pure compassion. It's a flexible, responsive system constantly weighing investment against probability of survival, and that calculation can shift dramatically depending on environmental pressure, which is honestly a far more interesting and nuanced explanation than simply assuming animals are uniformly soft and protective toward anything small and cute. There's also a genuinely underrated example worth bringing up here. Domestic cats and their surprisingly specific tolerance thresholds toward kittens compared to adult cats. Anyone who's spent time around a multi-cat household has probably noticed that adult cats, even fairly grumpy, low-tolerance individuals, will often allow kittens to do things that would immediately trigger a hiss or a swat if attempted by another adult cat, pouncing unexpectedly, stealing food directly from a bowl mid-meal, climbing over a sleeping adult without any warning whatsoever. This tolerance isn't universal across all adult cats. Some show very little patience regardless of age, but it shows up consistently enough across enough individuals that researchers studying domestic cat social behavior have documented it as a measurable, repeatable pattern rather than just anecdotal cuteness. Even in a species famous for its general indifference and low tolerance for nonsense, something about the specific signals of kitten seems to occasionally bypass the usual grumpiness settings entirely. Finally, it's worth touching on how zoos and wildlife sanctuaries have actually used this differentiated treatment phenomenon as a genuinely practical conservation tool. Caretakers working with endangered species have learned to recognize and sometimes deliberately trigger these baby schema responses in adult animals to encourage successful fostering or cross-species nursing in emergency situations where an orphaned animal needs immediate caretaking and no biological parent is available. By understanding exactly which physical and behavioral cues trigger increased tolerance and caretaking instinct in a given species, conservationists have successfully facilitated surrogate parenting arrangements that would have seemed completely implausible without a solid understanding of exactly how deeply wired this differentiated treatment toward young actually is. It's a genuinely elegant example of scientific understanding translating directly into real-world impact, saving individual animals by working with instincts that evolution built millions of years before anyone thought to study them this closely. So, do animals treat babies differently? Overwhelmingly? Resoundingly? Yes. And the mechanisms behind it turn out to be a genuinely fascinating mix of hardwired visual triggers, measurable hormonal shifts, deliberate behavioral calibration, and evolutionary logic tied directly to genetic investment and species survival. This isn't some simple, universal kindness switch that flips on whenever something small and helpless wanders into view, though that baby schema trigger does a lot of heavy lifting across an impressively wide range of species. It's a layered, surprisingly sophisticated system that adjusts tolerance, gentleness, communication style, physical restraint, and even risk tolerance, all specifically calibrated around the presence of vulnerable young, sometimes overriding instincts as powerful as predatory drive itself. And maybe the most interesting part of all this is how familiar it feels once you really look at it closely. The exaggerated gentle play, the simplified communication style, the temporary suspension of normal rules, the willingness to take on serious risk specifically to protect something small and helpless. These aren't uniquely human parenting behaviors that occasionally show up in animals by coincidence. They're ancient, deeply conserved evolutionary strategies that show up across an enormous range of unrelated species precisely because they work, because populations that protect, indulge, and patiently nurture their young consistently outcompete populations that don't. We're not actually special for treating our babies differently. We're just one more entry on an extremely long list of species that figured out, somewhere along the evolutionary road, that the smallest, clumsiest, most rule-breaking members of the group are usually the ones most worth protecting, indulging, and giving just a little bit of extra grace to, right up until the day the puppy license finally expires.